The iron gate was open by exactly 3 inches. That was all Vespera Thorne needed. Rain hammered down across the English countryside, soaking through her threadbare wool coat and the thin cotton dress beneath it. Her boots squelched against the gravel path as she squeezed herself through the gap in the wrought iron gates of Oakhaven Manor. She had no intention of stealing anything. All she wanted was to stop shivering long enough to feel her fingers again. The conservatory was attached to the east side of the manor, its glass panels fogged with warmth from the coal-heated pipes beneath the stone floor. Vespera found a service door tucked behind a row of overgrown hedges. The latch was old. One firm push, and it gave way with a soft click. Inside, the air hit her like a blanket, warm, thick, carrying the scent of damp earth and green leaves. Rows of potted ferns lined the tiled walkway, their broad leaves catching the low glow of a single oil lamp burning on a side table. Vespera closed the door behind her and stood still, letting the warmth crawl back into her bones. She should have stopped there. She should have curled up behind the largest fern, slept until the rain passed, and slipped out before dawn. Instead, she noticed the door at the far end of the conservatory. It was slightly open, and through the gap she could see the edge of a gilded picture frame catching the lamplight. Vespera had always been weak when it came to paintings. She crossed the conservatory and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a private gallery, long, rectangular, with dark oak paneling and a polished marble floor reflecting the soft amber glow of standing oil lamps. Paintings hung in heavy frames on every wall, landscapes, portraits, still lifes, each illuminated by its own small brass lamp mounted above the frame. At the center of the far wall, positioned like a throne among commoners, hung the largest piece in the collection, a Renaissance oil painting. Shepherds gathered beneath twisted olive trees, the sky streaked with the deep gold and rose of a Mediterranean sunset. The brushwork was extraordinary. Every blade of grass seemed to catch light from a sun that had set 300 years ago. Vespera stepped closer, her fingers hovering an inch from the canvas. She tilted her head, squinted, and leaned in until her nose nearly touched the lower right corner where the shepherd's crook met the edge of a stone wall. Something was wrong. The cracking pattern in the paint was too uniform. In a genuine work from the 15th century, the linseed oil binding would have dried and cracked in an unpredictable web, thicker near the impasto, thinner in the glazed passages. This cracking was even, mechanical, as though someone had baked the canvas in a low oven and dragged a fine needle across the surface to simulate 3 centuries of aging. Vespera ran her thumbnail along the edge of the frame where paint met wood. A tiny flake lifted. She rubbed it between her fingers. Fresh, still slightly pliable. This painting was no older than 6 months. "Step away from that canvas!" The voice came from behind her, deep, clipped, and cold enough to freeze the warm air in the gallery. Vespera turned slowly. A tall man stood in the doorway, holding a brass candlestick in one hand and a flintlock pistol in the other. He wore a dark green velvet dressing gown over a white linen shirt, his dark hair disheveled as though he had been roused from sleep. His jaw was set hard, and his grey eyes moved from Vespera's face to the painting behind her with the sharp precision of a man used to assessing threats quickly. Lord Thaddeus Vance, the Duke of Oakhaven. "I asked you to step away," he repeated, setting the candlestick down without taking his eyes off her. Vespera raised both hands. "I have taken nothing, sir." "You are standing in my private gallery at midnight, dripping rainwater onto my marble floor with your fingers on a painting worth more than every house in the village combined." He stepped closer. "What are you doing here?" Vespera glanced at the painting, then back at the Duke. A dozen lies lined up in her head. She was a lost traveler, a servant from a neighboring estate, a woman separated from her coach. Any of them would have been safer than the truth. She told the truth anyway. "I came in from the rain. The conservatory door was unlocked. I saw the gallery, and I could not help myself."
She paused.
And if you are going to call the magistrate over a trespasser, you might want to call him over your art dealer as well."
Thaddeus narrowed his eyes.
"What did you say?"
Vespera pointed at the painting behind her.
"That piece is a forgery. A very good one of the finest I have ever seen. The linseed binding is modern, the pigment cracking has been manufactured with heat and a scoring tool, and the ground layer beneath the paint is chalk and gypsum mixed in a ratio only developed in the last 20 years. Whoever sold it to you as a genuine Renaissance original is a thief."
The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to press against the walls of the gallery. Thaddeus stared at her. The pistol in his hand lowered an inch, then another, until the barrel was pointing at the floor. "Who are you?" he asked.
"Nobody," Vespera said. "I am nobody at all." He studied her, the torn hem of her dress, the rain plastered against her dark hair, the hollow sharpness of cheekbones that spoke of too many missed meals. Then he looked at her hands. Her fingers were stained with traces of ink and solvent, the nails trimmed short in the manner of someone who worked with fine detail. Those were not the hands of a common thief. Thaddeus set the pistol down on the table. He walked past her to the gallery door, pulled it shut, and turned the key in the lock. Then he crossed to the main entrance on the opposite side and locked that as well. Vespera watched him with growing unease. "What are you doing?" He pocketed both keys and turned to face her. "The gates of this estate close at 10 o'clock each evening. The groundskeeper secures every entrance and the housekeeper checks every window latch before she retires." He folded his arms. "You broke into my home, examined my most prized possession without permission, and told me, with a certainty I find rather alarming, that the centerpiece of my entire collection is a fraud." He took one step toward her. "You are not going anywhere." Vespera felt the warmth of the gallery drain away. She had walked into this estate looking for shelter from a storm. Now she was locked inside it with a man who looked at her as though she were either the answer to a question he had been asking for months or the cause of a problem he intended to solve before sunrise. Vespera did not sleep that night. Thaddeus had summoned his housekeeper, Mrs. Hargrove, and instructed her to prepare the smallest guest chamber on the second floor. The room was modest, a narrow bed with clean linen, a washstand, a single window overlooking the courtyard. The door had no lock on the inside. Vespera sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, listening to the rain, and wondered what kind of trouble she had walked herself into. By morning, the storm had passed. A knock came at the door before she had finished lacing her boots. A footman in dark blue livery stood in the corridor. "His lordship requests your presence in the private library, miss." The library was on the ground floor, through heavy oak doors at the end of a corridor lined with ancestral portraits. Thaddeus stood beside a writing desk near the window, dressed in a fitted charcoal tailcoat and polished riding boots. A tray of tea sat untouched beside a stack of correspondence. The painting from the gallery had been placed on an easel in the center of the room, angled to catch the daylight. Thaddeus gestured to a chair opposite the desk. "Sit down." Vespera remained standing. "Am I a prisoner?" "You are a guest who has not yet earned my trust." He poured 2 cups of tea and set one on her side of the desk. "Sit." She sat. Thaddeus opened a leather-bound ledger and turned it to face her. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, dates, names, sums of money, descriptions of artworks. He tapped his finger on an entry dated 3 months prior. "I purchased that painting," he said, nodding toward the easel, "from a dealer named Ashworth in London. He presented it as a 15th-century Florentine pastoral, authenticated by 2 independent assessors. I paid £900 for it. That is more than most families in this county will earn in a lifetime." Vespera looked at the ledger entry. The sum was written in careful copperplate, alongside Ashworth's name and a description of the piece that matched the canvas on the easel down to its dimensions. "Ashworth delivered it personally," Thaddeus continued. "He dined here, toured the gallery with my steward, and stayed 2 nights before returning to the capital. He paused. 3 weeks later, I noticed the painting seemed to hang differently in its frame. The canvas tension had changed. I dismissed it as cold weather affecting the stretcher bars. He looked at Vespera. You are telling me that I was right to be suspicious. You were, Vespera said. That canvas has never seen the inside of a Florentine workshop. The stretcher bars are English oak, freshly cut and seasoned in a hurry. The ground layer is local chalk, and the varnish was applied in a single coat to mimic the amber patina of age. Whoever made this studied the original closely enough to reproduce every brushstroke. They had access to it for days, perhaps weeks. Thaddeus sat down slowly. You are suggesting that someone swapped my genuine painting for this copy while it hung in my own gallery? I am telling you that is exactly what happened. A heavy silence settled over the room. Thaddeus stared at the painting on the easel, and Vespera could see the anger working behind his eyes. Steady, controlled, the kind of fury that belonged to a man who had commanded soldiers and learned long ago that losing his temper solved nothing. I want to examine the frame more closely, Vespera said. He waved his hand toward the easel. Go ahead. Vespera carried an oil lamp from the desk and held it close to the lower edge of the gilded frame. She tilted it slowly, letting the light rake across the surface at a shallow angle. The varnish on the frame was genuinely old, likely original to the real painting, which meant the forger had transferred his work into the authentic frame to avoid detection. Then she saw it. Just below the bottom rail, pressed into the still tacky varnish where canvas met wood, was a mark. Barely visible, a tiny symbol no larger than a thumbprint, shaped like a stylized feather crossed with a single diagonal line. Vespera's stomach dropped. She knew that mark. She had seen it 3 years ago on a forged maritime charter that nearly ruined a shipping merchant in Bristol, and again on a counterfeit deed that had displaced 2 farming families in the north. The name attached to it was whispered among engravers and black market dealers from London to Edinburgh. Gabriel Kalin, she said quietly. Thaddeus rose from his chair. You know the forger? I know of him. Every craftsman working outside the law does. Kalin runs a syndicate. Forgers, couriers, corrupt dealers, auction house insiders. He operates out of the capital, though nobody knows his exact location. If this mark is on your frame, your original painting is already in his possession, and he intends to sell it abroad. Thaddeus walked to the window. The morning light caught the hard line of his jaw, and his hands gripped the windowsill until his knuckles whitened. Then I will get it back. He turned to face her. You identified the forgery in minutes. You recognized Kalin's mark on sight. I need someone with that knowledge beside me. Vespera shook her head. I am a disgraced apprentice, sleeping on docks and breaking into estates for warmth. I am hardly the companion a duke takes into a fight against a syndicate. And yet you are the only person who has stood in front of that painting and told me the truth. He placed a small velvet pouch on the desk. It clinked with the weight of gold coins. 30 sovereigns now, 70 more when my painting is recovered. I will provide lodgings, clothing, safe passage, and my personal protection for as long as this takes. Vespera stared at the pouch. 100 sovereigns was enough to start over. A workshop, materials, a clean name in a town far from London. She looked at the mark on the frame again. Kalin's feather, the same mark that had ended her apprenticeship when her master was falsely accused of producing Kalin's forgeries and stripped of his license. This was dangerous. Kalin did not forgive people who interfered with his work. She picked up the pouch. When do we start? 2 days passed before they could move. Thaddeus spent the morning of the 3rd day dismissing his valet and 2 footmen on fabricated errands to the village, thinning the household staff enough that he and Vespera could leave the manor without a trail of questions behind them. By late afternoon, as the winter sun began to sink behind the tree line, They slipped out through the kitchen garden gate and followed a narrow dirt path through a stand of birch trees at the edge of the estate grounds. The old carriage house sat at the end of the path, half hidden behind a stone wall thick with ivy. It had once served as a coach repair shed, and the smell of axle grease and dried hay still clung to the timber beams. A workbench ran along the far wall beneath dusty windows, and a single coal brazier stood cold in the corner. Thaddeus lit the brazier while Vespera unpacked the supplies she had requested: linseed oil, turpentine, ground chalk, gypsum, glass jars, a copper mixing bowl, fine hog hair brushes, and a magnifying lens from the Manor's study. She arranged everything along the workbench with practiced efficiency. "You move like a woman who has spent years at a workbench," Thaddeus observed from beside the brazier. "I spent 7 years at one," Vespera said without looking up. "My master, Mr. Harlan, was a licensed engraver in Bristol. He taught me everything: ink composition, paper aging, pigment chemistry, brushwork analysis. I could identify the workshop origin of a painting by the mineral content of its ground layer before I turned 19. "What happened to him?" Vespera's hands paused over the mixing bowl. "Someone planted 3 forged banknotes in his workshop. The guild revoked his license, and the magistrate seized his tools. He lost everything in a single afternoon. He died 6 months later in a lodging house near the docks." She resumed grinding the chalk. "The forgeries carried Kalen's feather mark. I found it after the trial, hidden in the engraving lines. By then it was too late." Thaddeus said nothing for a moment. The brazier crackled between them. "So this is personal for you," he said. "Everything about Gabriel Kalen is personal for me." She turned her attention to the forged painting, which Thaddeus had wrapped in oilcloth and carried under his arm from the manor. Vespera propped it against the wall and used a thin blade to scrape a tiny sample of varnish from the lower corner. She dropped the flake into a jar of turpentine and held it up to the fading window light. "Watch," she said. The varnish dissolved quickly, too quickly. A genuine centuries-old varnish, hardened by decades of oxidation, would resist turpentine for minutes. This sample broke apart in seconds, releasing a faint amber tint into the liquid. "Copal resin," Vespera said, "mixed with a small amount of heated beeswax to give it body. This is Kalen's signature formula. I have seen it on 4 other forgeries in the last 3 years. He uses it because it mimics the color and sheen of aged damar varnish, and most collectors cannot tell the difference without a chemical test." She mixed a small batch using the materials on the workbench: copal resin dissolved in turpentine, a 1/4 spoon of melted beeswax stirred in while the mixture was still warm. When she brushed it onto a scrap of canvas and held it beside the forged painting, the color and texture were identical. Thaddeus leaned forward and compared the two. A perfect match. "Which tells us something important." Vespera set the brush down. "Kalen does not work from memory or from sketches. His reproductions are too precise. He copies directly from the original, which means he had your painting in his possession for weeks, possibly longer. He needed time to study every brushstroke, match every pigment, age the canvas, and prepare the varnish." Thaddeus straightened up. "The painting has hung in that gallery for 11 years. The only time anyone outside my household had extended access to it was when Ashworth visited 3 months ago." "Ashworth stayed 2 nights, Vespera said. "That is not enough time to produce a forgery of this quality. Kalen would have needed the original for at least a fortnight, and he would have needed detailed measurements of the gallery, the wall mountings, the lighting angles, the frame dimensions, to ensure the swap went undetected." The implications settled over Thaddeus like a cold draft through the carriage house walls. "Someone in my household gave him that access," he said. Vespera nodded. "Someone who knows the gallery schedule. Someone who knows when the rooms are locked, when the staff retires, and when you travel away from the estate. Someone who could arrange for the painting to be removed, delivered to Kalen's workshop, and replaced with the forgery without raising a single question." Thaddeus turned away and walked to the window. Outside, the last light was draining from the sky, and the birch trees stood like pale sentinels against the darkening hills. "I have 14 people on my household staff," he said quietly. "I have known most of them for years. My steward, Mr. Aldous, has served this family since my father's time." "Then we do not confront anyone yet," Vespera said. "If your informant discovers that you know about the forgery, they will send word to Kalin, and your original painting will vanish from wherever it is being held. We need to find it first." Thaddeus turned from the window. "How?" "Kalin sells through auction houses, private, invitation-only sales where the buyers are foreign collectors who do not ask difficult questions. If your painting is still in England, it will surface at one of those auctions within the next fortnight." She paused. "I know how to find them. The question is whether a duke is willing to walk into a room full of criminals and pretend he belongs there." Thaddeus looked at her across the dim workshop, the brazier casting long shadows across his face. "I have walked into worse rooms than that, Miss Thorne." The dress arrived on the morning of the 8th day. Vespera stood in the guest chamber and stared at it, laid across the bed, dove-grey silk with ivory lace at the collar and cuffs, cut in the fashionable high-waisted style. Beside it sat kidskin gloves, a pearl brooch, and a velvet cloak lined with dark satin. She had never worn anything like it. "You will be introduced as Miss Ashford," Thaddeus said from the doorway, already dressed in a black evening coat, cream waistcoat, and a starched cravat pinned with a small sapphire. "A private art consultant recently arrived from Edinburgh. You specialize in Renaissance acquisitions for unnamed clients on the continent. You speak little, observe everything, and under no circumstances do you touch any of the pieces on display." "And if someone recognizes me?" "Nobody in Ravenstone has ever seen you. The circles you moved in were workshops and backstreet dealers, not auction parlors. Tonight, you are someone else entirely." They traveled by closed carriage through the darkening countryside, the horses' hooves steady on the packed road as the last light faded behind the hills. Ravenstone was a port town on the eastern coast, shipping warehouses, chandlers' shops, and narrow cobblestone lanes that smelled of salt and tar. The kind of town where cargo arrived and departed without much scrutiny. The Gilded Anchor Auction House occupied a converted merchant's hall near the harbour, a limestone building with tall arched windows, its entrance flanked by iron lanterns. A liveried doorman checked invitations at the threshold. Thaddeus handed over a cream-coloured card embossed with a false name, Lord Pemberton of Ashwick, and the doorman waved them through without hesitation. Inside, candelabras hung from the ceiling on brass chains, filling the room with golden light. Paintings and small sculptures lined the walls on velvet-draped stands, each accompanied by a handwritten catalogue card listing its title, attributed artist, and provenance. 40 or 50 guests moved between the displays, speaking in the measured tones of people accustomed to spending large sums quietly. Vespera kept her hands clasped in front of her and her expression neutral, chin level, eyes steady, the slight downward glance of a woman who examined art for a living and found most of it beneath her attention. They moved through the room slowly. Thaddeus paused at each piece long enough to appear interested, murmuring observations loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Vespera played her role, a tilt of the head here, a quiet word of assessment there, nothing that invited extended conversation. It was on the second pass through the eastern wall that she found it. The painting was smaller than she expected, or rather it looked smaller in this setting, crowded between a Venetian harbor scene and a Dutch still life of wilting flowers. The catalogue card beside it read, "Pastoral Reverie, Circle of Giorgione, Private Collection, Provenance Unrecorded." Vespera stopped walking. The shepherds beneath the olive trees, the Mediterranean sunset bleeding gold into rose, the crook resting against the stone wall. Every brushstroke was alive in a way the forgery at Oakhaven had failed to capture. The depth of the glazing, the warmth of the undertones, the way the light seemed to breathe inside the paint rather than sit on top of it. This was the original. She felt Thaddeus stiffen beside her. He had seen it too. His hand moved slightly toward the catalogue card, and Vespera placed her gloved fingers on his wrist. a gesture so small that anyone watching would have mistaken it for a casual touch between companions. "Do not react," she murmured. "We are being watched." Thaddeus let his hand drop. His eyes moved to the reflection in a nearby glass display case, and he saw what Vespera had already noticed. A broad-shouldered man in a brown frock coat stood near the entrance, scanning the room with the slow gaze of someone cataloging faces. He had been watching them since their second pass through the hall. "Kalen's man?" Thaddeus asked under his breath. "Almost certainly. He has been tracking our movement since we passed the Dutch collection. If we approach the painting again or attempt to bid on it, he will know we came here looking for it." Thaddeus exhaled slowly. Years of military service had taught him when to press forward and when to hold ground. "Then we give him nothing to report," he said. He turned away from the eastern wall and guided Vespera toward a smaller display near the auctioneer's podium. A charcoal sketch of a country chapel, unremarkable, inexpensive, the kind of piece a gentleman might purchase as a passing fancy. Thaddeus raised his hand and placed a bid of £4. The auctioneer acknowledged it. No one countered. The sketch was his. While the clerk wrapped the purchase, Vespera committed the room to memory. Every exit, the service door behind the auctioneer's stand, the loading bay visible through a gap in the curtains where crates were being prepared for transport. She counted the staff and noted the placement of the guards. They collected the sketch and left without hurrying. In the carriage, with the door closed and the horses pulling away from the harbor, Thaddeus finally spoke. "It was right there. And it will be there tomorrow, packed into a shipping crate bound for the continent. We have days at most before it leaves England." Vespera pulled her gloves off. "We need to find out where Kalen stores the originals before shipment. The auction house is only the shop front. The real operation is somewhere else, a workshop or warehouse with enough space to hold dozens of canvases." "And the man watching us?" "He saw two wealthy collectors browsing and purchasing a minor sketch. If we are lucky, that is all he will report." She looked out the carriage window at the dark harbor receding behind them. "If we are unlucky, Kalen already knows the Duke of Oakhaven is looking for his painting." Thaddeus leaned back against the leather seat and stared at the wrapped sketch resting on his knee. £4, he said quietly. "I just paid £4 for a drawing I do not want, to protect a painting worth 900 that is sitting in a room full of thieves." Vespera almost smiled. "Welcome to the art trade, Your Grace." They left Ravenstone before dawn. Thaddeus had arranged lodgings at a coaching inn on the edge of town, paying in cash under the false name. Neither of them slept well. Vespera sat by the window, watching the street below for any sign of the broad-shouldered man from the auction. She saw nothing, which worried her more than if she had. By first light, they were already in the carriage, heading west along the coast road toward Ironwood Keep, where Thaddeus intended to meet a solicitor named Cartwright, who had handled the Vance family's legal affairs for 2 decades. "If we can present Cartwright with enough evidence that the auction house is selling stolen originals," Thaddeus said, adjusting the leather satchel on the seat beside him, "he can petition the county magistrate for a warrant of seizure before the paintings leave the country." Vespera nodded, though something tugged at the back of her mind. They had been careful at the auction. They had purchased a minor sketch, spoken to no one of consequence, and departed without incident. The operative had watched them, yes, but watching was all he had done. So why did the road behind them feel wrong? She turned and looked through the small rear window. The coast road curved along a chalk cliff that dropped to the sea below. Morning mist clung to the scrubland, and 1/2 a mile back, a black coach drawn by 2 horses was gaining on them. "We have company," she said. Thaddeus leaned across and looked. The black coach was moving fast, faster than any casual traveler would on a narrow cliff road at dawn. Its curtains were drawn, the driver hunched low, whipping the horses forward. "That is a pursuit, not a coincidence," Thaddeus said. He opened the small hatch in the roof and called up to his driver. "Jennings, Give the horses their heads and do not slow down until I tell you." The carriage lurched forward. Vespera gripped the edge of her seat as the wheels rattled over the uneven road, the chalk cliff dropping away to their left, the open moorland rising to their right. The black coach did not fall back. It was closing the distance. "They want the satchel," Vespera said. "The notes I made at the auction, the catalog descriptions, the layout of the display room, the false title on your painting. If Kalen's people get hold of those, they will know exactly what we saw and what we are planning." Thaddeus pulled the satchel onto his lap and looked out the window. The road ahead narrowed where the cliff curved sharply inward, funneling traffic into a single lane bordered on one side by a low stone wall and on the other by a steep embankment choked with gorse. He had seen terrain like this before. On the peninsula, during the campaigns, he had learned that a narrow pass was a gift to the defender, if you knew how to use it. "Jennings," he called through the hatch again, "when we reach the bend, pull hard to the right and block the inside line. Give them only the cliff edge." The driver obeyed. As the carriage swung around the curve, Jennings hauled the horses to the right, positioning the carriage diagonally across the narrow road so that the only clear path for the pursuing coach was the outer edge, the side where the stone wall was lowest and the chalk cliff crumbled away to a steep, grassy slope 30 feet below. The black coach came around the bend at full speed. Its driver saw the blocked road too late. He yanked the reins left, trying to squeeze past on the cliffside, but the wheels caught the crumbling edge of the road. The stone wall buckled under the weight, and the entire coach tilted, skidded sideways, and tipped into the embankment ditch with a terrible grinding of wood and iron. Thaddeus was out of his carriage before the dust settled. The black coach lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still spinning. The horses were tangled in their harnesses. The driver had been thrown clear and sat dazed on the grass. There were no passengers. The coach had been sent with the driver alone, a pursuit vehicle meant to overtake and force them to stop. Vespera climbed down after Thaddeus and circled the wreckage. Beneath the overturned driver's bench, she spotted a leather courier pouch, the kind used by private messengers to carry sealed correspondence between estates. It had been thrown from the coach on impact and lay half buried in the wet grass. She opened it. Inside were 3 sealed letters. 2 were addressed to names she did not recognize, likely contacts within Kalen's network. The third made her breath catch in her throat. It was addressed to Gabriel Kalen, care of a post office box in the capital. The handwriting was precise, formal, practiced, and the wax seal on the back bore a crest she recognized immediately. The Vance family crest. The same seal that sat on the writing desk in Thaddeus's private library. She broke the seal and read. The letter confirmed the Duke's travel schedule for the past month, listed the dates he had been absent from the estate, described the security arrangements for the gallery in careful detail, and closed with a request for the next payment of 20 guineas to be delivered through the usual channel. It was signed A. Vespera. Handed the letter to Thaddeus without a word. She watched his face as he read it. The color drained from his jaw first, then his cheeks, then his forehead, until he stood white-faced in the morning light, holding the letter like it had burned him. "Aldous," he said. One word. Quiet. Certain. His steward. The man who had served the Vance family since his father's time. The man who had access to every room, every schedule, every key in Oakhaven Manor. Thaddeus folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat. "We are going home," he said. They returned to Oakhaven Manor 2 nights later, entering through the kitchen garden gate after dark. Thaddeus had spent the journey in silence. Vespera knew the difference between his thinking silence and his angry silence by now. This was the second kind, steady, patient, waiting. The manor was quiet. The staff had retired, and only a few oil lamps burned in the corridors. Thaddeus dismissed Mrs. Hargrove at the servants' entrance and led Vespera through the darkened hallways toward the east wing. "Mister," Aldous occupied a private suite at the end of the servants' corridor. 2 rooms, better furnished than those of any other staff member. A perk of 23 years of what had passed for loyalty until 3 days ago. Thaddeus did not knock. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Aldous was seated at a small writing desk near the window, a quill in one hand and a sheet of paper half covered in his neat, careful script. He looked up with the startled expression of a man caught mid-sentence in a conversation he should never have been having. "Your Grace," he said, rising from the chair. "I was not informed you had returned. Sit down, Mr. Aldous." The steward's eyes moved from Thaddeus to Vespera, who stood in the doorway behind the Duke, and then back again. Something shifted in his face, a small tightening around the mouth, a flicker behind the eyes that lasted less than a second. He sat. Thaddeus reached inside his coat, removed the intercepted letter, and placed it on the desk in front of Aldous. The wax seal, the Vance family crest, faced upward. "I recovered this from a courier pouch on the road from Ravenstone," Thaddeus said. "It is addressed to Gabriel Kalin. It describes my travel schedule, my gallery security, and the dates I was absent from this estate. It is written in your hand, Mr. Aldous, and it is signed with your initial." Aldous stared at the letter. His right hand trembled once, then stilled. He did not reach for it. "I will not insult you by asking whether you wrote it," Thaddeus continued. "I have known your penmanship for 20 years. What I want to know is everything else. Where is Kalin operating from? Where are the original paintings? And how many works have you helped him steal from this house and from others?" The room was so quiet that Vespera could hear the ticking of the long case clock in the corridor outside. Aldous sat motionless for a long moment. Then something in his posture collapsed. Not dramatically, not with any great show of emotion, but in the small, defeated way of a man who had been carrying a weight for years and had just felt it slip from his shoulders. "He contacted me 14 months ago," Aldous said, his voice flat, emptied of everything except facts. "A letter to the servants' entrance, addressed to me by name. He knew about debts I had accumulated, obligations I could not meet on a steward's wages. He offered 20 guineas for each piece of information. Gallery dimensions, hanging schedules, which nights the house was empty, which doors were unsecured." "And you accepted," Thaddeus said. "I accepted." Aldous looked at the desk. "I told myself it was only information. I was not stealing anything. I was not forging anything. I was answering questions. You gave a thief the keys to my home." Aldous flinched. "Yes." Vespera stepped forward. "Where does Kalin work?" The steward looked at her, this woman in a borrowed dress asking questions with the authority of someone who had every right to be there. He did not ask who she was. "There is an old textile mill on the Capital riverfront," he said, "south of the Blackfriars Bridge, near the dockyards. Shut down 5 years ago when the owner went bankrupt. Kalin took it over through an intermediary. The upper floors are where forgeries are produced, mixing rooms, drying racks, painting stations. The ground floor is for storage and shipping. Dozens of originals sit in lined crates, waiting to be loaded onto merchant vessels bound for France and Holland." "How do you know this?" Vespera asked. "Because he took me there once, 8 months ago. He wanted me to see the scale of his operation, to understand I was part of something too large to walk away from." Aldous paused. He was right. Thaddeus stood perfectly still throughout. When Aldous finished, the Duke walked to the window and looked out at the darkened grounds he had managed with care for a decade and trusted this man to protect. "Here is what will happen," Thaddeus said, turning back to face the steward. "You will write a letter to Kalin tonight. In it, you will confirm that the Duke of Oakhaven has returned from a routine visit to the coast and remains entirely unaware that any painting has been swapped. You will tell him that security at the manor is unchanged and that there is no cause for concern." Aldous blinked. "You want me to lie to him?" I want you to do for me what you have been doing for him. The difference is that this time, the lie serves the man you should have been serving all along." Aldous looked at the half-written letter on his desk, the one he had been composing when they walked in. He pulled a fresh sheet from the drawer, dipped his quill, and began to write. Thaddeus watched over his shoulder until every line was finished, the ink blotted, and the letter sealed with plain wax.
"If you send word to Kaelin through any other channel," Thaddeus said quietly, "I will know, and you will spend the rest of your years in a place considerably less comfortable than this room." Aldous handed over the letter without meeting his eyes. In the corridor outside, Vespera fell into step beside Thaddeus as they walked back toward the main house. She waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. "Do you trust him to stay silent?" "I trust him to be afraid," Thaddeus said. "For now, that will do." The capital smelled of coal smoke and river water. They arrived on the evening of the 15th day, having traveled by hired coach to avoid using the Vance family carriage. Thaddeus wore a plain wool overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat, the clothes of a merchant. Vespera carried a leather satchel, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, was the thing she had spent 3 days preparing in the carriage house workshop. A freshly painted replica of the pastoral scene. Damp, imperfect, deliberately rough. They crossed the river south of Blackfriars as the last of the daylight bled from the sky. The old textile mill stood at the end of a narrow lane between 2 derelict warehouses, its brick walls blackened with soot, windows boarded from the inside. A rusted sign above the door still bore the name of the bankrupt company. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Vespera knew better. The loading doors at the rear would be the way in, built for quick, quiet access after dark. They circled through a service alley along the riverbank. At the rear of the mill, heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, lantern light visible through the gap. No guards outside. Kaelin relied on secrecy. A man who believed his operation was invisible had no reason to post sentries. Thaddeus pushed the door open and they slipped inside. The ground floor was exactly as Aldous had described. Rows of wooden shipping crates lined the walls, stacked 2 and 3 high, each one stenciled with false shipping labels. Textile samples, ceramic goods, household furnishings. The air was thick with the smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and fresh sawdust. Lanterns hung from iron hooks along the ceiling beams, casting long, amber shadows across the stone floor. Vespera moved quickly between the crates, reading the labels, checking the dimensions. She was looking for a specific size. The pastoral scene was 32 inches by 44, and the crate holding it would be lined with felt to prevent the canvas from shifting during transport. She found it against the far wall, beneath a stack of smaller boxes. The stencil read, "Flemish drapery. Fragile." She pried the lid with a flat iron bar Thaddeus handed her, and the nails gave way with a low creak. Inside, nestled in gray felt, lay the painting. The shepherds, the olive grove, the sunset that seemed to glow from within the canvas, even in the dim lantern light. Vespera lifted it carefully, holding the edges, and felt the weight of genuine age in the wood of the stretcher bars, dense, seasoned, 3 centuries dry. "This is it," she whispered. Thaddeus reached for it, and then they both heard the footsteps, heavy boots on the stone staircase at the far end of the room, more than one pair, coming down from the upper floors. Vespera moved fast. She pulled the replica from her satchel, still slightly damp, the paint tacky to the touch, and laid it face up inside the crate where the original had been. She pressed the edges into the felt lining so that the canvas sat in the same position, then replaced the lid and pushed the nails back into their holes with the heel of her palm. Thaddeus rolled the genuine painting and slid it into the leather satchel. He slung it across his back and pulled Vespera behind a tall stack of crates near the loading doors. The footsteps reached the ground floor. 3 men emerged from the stairwell. 2 of them were broad, rough-looking, the kind of men hired for their size rather than their conversation. The third was different. He was tall and lean,
dressed in a dark blue frock coat with silver buttons, his hair combed back from a sharp, narrow face. He carried a brass-handled walking stick and moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned every object in the room. Gabriel Kalin. Vespera had never seen him before. She had imagined someone rougher, more obviously criminal. Kalin looked like a gentleman, the sort you might find at a dinner party discussing poetry. That was what made him dangerous. Kalin walked along the row of crates, running his fingers across the lids, pausing occasionally to check a label. He stopped at the crate Vespera had just resealed.
"This one ships tomorrow on the morning tide," he said to one of his men. "The buyer in Amsterdam is expecting it by the end of the month." He lifted the lid. Vespera held her breath. Kalin looked down at the replica. He tilted his head, leaned closer, and touched the surface of the canvas with one finger. When he pulled it back, a faint smear of wet paint clung to his fingertip. His expression changed. The composure cracked. He wiped his finger on the edge of the crate and stared at the painting with the cold fury of a man looking at damaged goods. "Someone has been in here," he said. "This varnish is wet. The surface is compromised." He turned to his men. "Check the doors. Check every crate on this floor. Find out who touched this." In the confusion, guards splitting apart, lanterns lifted from hooks, crates dragged and opened, Thaddeus and Vespera slipped through the loading doors into the alley. They did not run. They walked, steady and quick, along the riverbank to the hired coach waiting 2 streets away. Thaddeus climbed in first, pulled Vespera up after him, tapped the roof twice, and the coach lurched into the dark streets. In the back of the coach, Vespera opened the satchel and looked at the rolled canvas inside. 300 years of brushwork, 900 pounds of stolen beauty, and one very angry forger behind them who had just discovered that his prized shipment was ruined. "How long before he realizes it is a decoy?" Thaddeus asked. "By morning, if he is thorough, by midday at the latest. He will scrape the surface and find fresh ground layer beneath. Then he will know someone took the original and left a fake in its place." She closed the satchel. "We have hours, not days." Thaddeus leaned forward. "Then we use them." The Grand Fine Arts Exposition opened on a Thursday afternoon beneath the vaulted glass ceiling of the Capitol Exhibition Hall. It was the event of the season. Collectors, dealers, and patrons filled a cavernous room draped in burgundy velvet, its marble columns wound with garlands. Crystal chandeliers threw light across rows of paintings on silk-covered stands, each framed and labeled with the kind of elegance that whispered old money and impeccable taste. Gabriel Kalin stood near the center of the hall, beside a roped-off private exhibition space. His display featured 12 paintings in a wide semicircle, each presented as a rediscovered masterwork from private European collections. The provenances were detailed. The asking prices were staggering. He greeted every approaching nobleman with a measured smile, guiding them through the collection with the ease of a man who had spent years selling beautiful lies. Vespera watched him from across the room. She stood beside Thaddeus near the entrance, dressed in a deep emerald gown with a fitted bodice and long sleeves. Her hair was pinned beneath a simple ivory comb. In one hand she held a thin leather portfolio, 3 days of meticulous work inside it. Chemical analyses, pigment comparisons, varnish composition charts, and brushwork sketches she had identified from memory and confirmed through testing. 5 of those 12 pieces are forgeries, she said quietly. The landscape second from the left, the portrait of the cardinal in the gilt frame, the harbor scene at the far end, the still life with the silver bowl, and the Madonna in the oval frame. I can prove each one. And the other 7? Thaddeus asked. Genuine. Stolen originals from private collections across England and the continent. Kalin mixes forgeries with authentic works so that the real pieces lend credibility to the fakes. If a buyer tests one painting and finds it genuine, they assume the rest are as well.
Thaddeus scanned the room. Near the far wall, Magistrate Harwood, the senior judicial authority for the district, stood with two exposition directors.
Thaddeus had arranged his presence through his solicitor, Cartwright, 2 days prior. "Harwood is here," Thaddeus said. "Good. We do this publicly, in front of every collector in the room. Kalen has built his reputation on trust and discretion. Once that is broken in front of this audience, no dealer or auction house in England will touch him again." They waited until the exposition director called exhibitors to present their collections. Kalen was the third. He stepped inside the roped display and began, smooth, confident, every word rehearsed. He described provenances, named the estates of supposed discovery, and quoted authentication reports from assessors whose names Vespera recognized as either fictional or long deceased. Halfway through his presentation, Thaddeus stepped forward. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with the steady authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms far less comfortable than this one. "I have reason to question the authenticity of several pieces in this collection, and I have brought evidence to support that claim." The room went still. Kalen's smile held, though the warmth behind it disappeared. "Your Grace," Kalen said, recognizing Thaddeus immediately, "I was not aware you had an interest in today's exhibition." "My interest is in the painting you stole from my gallery at Oakhaven Manor and attempted to sell through your auction house in Ravenstone under a false title." Thaddeus gestured to Vespera. "Miss Thorne is a trained specialist in paint composition and forgery detection. She will present her findings." Every eye in the room turned to Vespera. She opened the portfolio and stepped toward the first painting, the landscape second from the left. She spoke clearly, without rushing, directing her words to Magistrate Harwood and the exposition directors as much as to the crowd. "This landscape is attributed to a Flemish master working in the early 16th century. The pigment used in the sky, however, contains Prussian blue, a compound that was not developed until 1704. The ground layer is local English chalk, and the varnish is a copal and beeswax mixture less than 2 years old. This painting was produced in a workshop, likely within the last 18 months. She moved to the portrait of the cardinal. The craquelure on this piece has been manufactured using heat and a scoring tool. The pattern is too regular to be natural aging. The stretcher bars are English oak, freshly cut." She continued through the harbor scene, the still life, and the Madonna, each time identifying the specific material evidence that proved the work was modern. She named the pigments, the binding agents, the varnish formulas. She pointed to brushwork inconsistencies visible under angled light. She laid the chemical analyses from her portfolio on the display stand for Harwood to examine. By the time she reached the fifth painting, the room was completely silent. Kalen had not moved. His walking stick rested against his leg, and his hands were clasped behind his back. The composure remained on his face like a mask, but Vespera could see the stillness beneath it. The stillness of a man calculating how many exits the building had and how quickly he could reach one. Magistrate Harwood stepped forward, examined the documents, and spoke briefly with the exposition directors. Then he raised his hand and signaled to 2 constables who had been standing near the entrance since before the event began, positioned there at Thaddeus's request. "Mr. Kalen," Harwood said, "I am ordering the immediate seizure of your entire inventory pending a full investigation into charges of art fraud, theft, and the sale of counterfeit goods. You will accompany these officers." Kalen looked at Thaddeus, then at Vespera. His eyes lingered on her for a long moment, measuring, memorizing, filing her away. "You have made an enemy today, Miss Thorne," he said softly. "I had one long before today," Vespera replied. "You simply did not know my name." The constables escorted Kalen from the hall. The crowd parted in silence as he passed. The painting went back on the wall on a Tuesday morning, 22 days after Vespera Thorne had first laid eyes on the forgery that had hung in its place.
Thaddeus carried it into the gallery himself. He would not let the footman touch it. He removed the false canvas from the frame with a careful, deliberate slowness, the same way a man might remove a splinter from his own hand, and set it face down on the floor without looking at it again. Then he lifted the original into the frame, aligned the stretcher bars with the mounting hooks, and stepped back. The shepherds returned to the wall of Oakhaven Manor. The olive grove, the crook against the stone, the Mediterranean sunset that glowed as though 3 centuries had not touched it. The gallery felt different with it there, fuller, settled, as if the room had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Vespera stood in the doorway and watched. She had spent the past 4 days in the guest chamber while Thaddeus handled the aftermath. Caitlin's arrest had sent ripples through the capital's art world. The magistrate's office seized the contents of the Riverside Mill, 43 paintings, 18 confirmed stolen originals traced to private collections across England, Scotland, and the continent. The forgery workshop had been catalogued and shut down. 3 associates had been taken into custody. 2 more fled the country. Mr. Aldous had been dismissed without public scandal. Thaddeus chose not to involve the magistrate, partly because Aldous's cooperation had made the mill raid possible, and partly because dragging a family servant through the courts would have turned private betrayal into public spectacle. Aldous packed his belongings into a single trunk and left through the kitchen gate on a grey morning, and nobody spoke his name after that. Vespera had watched him go from the upstairs window. She expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, she felt the hollow weight of watching a man walk away from the only life he had known, knowing his choices had earned him every step. Now, standing in the gallery doorway, she was thinking about her own walk. The 30 sovereigns were in a pouch tucked inside her coat. The remaining 70 sat in a locked box on Thaddeus's desk, waiting for her. 100 gold sovereigns. Enough for a fresh start. A workshop somewhere quiet. Materials, tools, a chance to build something clean. She should leave. The job was done. "Come in," Thaddeus said, without turning from the painting. Vespera crossed the gallery and stood beside him. The morning light fell across the canvas at the same angle it must have fallen every morning for the 11 years this painting had hung here. She wondered how many times Thaddeus had stood in this exact spot, looking at this exact scene, before someone had stolen it from under his nose. "I received a letter this morning from the Guild of Artisans," Thaddeus said, handing her a folded sheet of heavy cream paper, sealed with the Guild's embossed crest. Vespera opened it and read the first line twice. The Guild had reviewed her case at the formal petition of Lord Thaddeus Vance. In light of evidence that the charges against her former master, Mr. Harlan of Bristol, had been fabricated as part of Gabriel Cailin's criminal enterprise, the Guild voted to posthumously restore Mr. Harlan's license and formally clear Miss Vespera Thorne of all associated disgrace. She was no longer blacklisted. She was no longer disgraced. She could work, openly, under her own name, for the first time in 3 years. Her hands trembled around the edges of the letter. She folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest, and for a moment she could not speak. "You petitioned the Guild," she said finally. "I wrote to them the morning after the exposition, with the magistrate's evidence and Aldous' confession." He paused. "They responded quickly. I suspect they were embarrassed." Vespera looked at the letter again. Mr. Harlan's name, printed in the Guild's formal copperplate, cleared of every accusation. She wished he were alive to see it. She wished she could place this letter in his hands and watch his face. Some things arrived too late to fix what they should have prevented. "There is something else," Thaddeus said. He walked to the writing desk at the far end of the gallery and picked up a second document, heavier, bound in dark leather, with the Vance family seal pressed into the cover. "I am establishing the Oakhaven Art Foundation," he said, "a trust dedicated to the authentication, preservation, and protection of fine art collections across England. Every piece that passes through this estate will be examined, verified, and catalogued by a trained specialist. He held the document out to her.
I need a head curator and authenticator, someone who can identify a forgery in minutes, reproduce a forger's varnish from memory, and outwit a criminal syndicate while wearing a borrowed dress. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. The position includes a private residence on the estate grounds, a workshop, a full set of professional tools, and a salary that I suspect you will find considerably more reliable than sleeping on docks. Vespera looked at the document, then at the painting, the one she had identified as a fraud on a rain-soaked midnight 3 weeks ago, standing in this gallery in torn boots and a dripping coat. 22 days. That was all it had taken to go from breaking into a stranger's conservatory to being offered a life she had stopped believing was possible. She took the document from his hand. "I have one condition," she said. Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. "The conservatory door latch needs replacing. A firm push and it opens. That is a security concern." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had known him, he laughed. "I will have it seen to immediately, Miss Thorne." Vespera tucked the gilt letter into her coat beside the sovereigns, held the leather-bound document against her chest, and looked at the painting. The shepherds, the olive trees, the sunset that had outlasted centuries and forgeries and thieves. She was home.